Today I'm going to introduce you to some new faces. They're not pretty faces, and hopefully to many of you they're not familiar faces. They're the faces of tragedy. If you haven't been following safety procedures, then it's just a matter of time until you become just another statistic in an injury report.
You've probably heard a lot about the Hazard Communication Standard, warning labels, material safety data sheets, and chemical hazards. Well, pay attention, because chemical accidents can happen when safety is forgotten or ignored. Your life and the lives of your coworkers depend on your knowledge of working safely with hazardous chemicals. You're going to see what can happen when those safety procedures aren't remembered. Most of these workers we will be watching were lucky. They got away with only injuries. But others, each and every day, aren't so lucky. They suffer severe burns, dismemberment, and even death. So what is the cause of all these needless injuries and deaths? Well, sometimes it's simply a person who was just not paying attention and didn't follow the established safety practices and procedures in their written hazard communication plan. Then there are those people who got fooled into thinking unsafe acts and shortcuts were really safe. People who knew what they were doing, but actually only made their unsafe acts and shortcuts accepted practices until the accident happened.
In this series of true stories, you're going to witness several accidents. Study them closely. You're going to learn how each accident could have been avoided and how to keep them from happening to you and your coworkers. Now let's look at case number 1.
Sam and George were sent to repair a new overhead door in a printing plant warehouse. The foreman wanted to keep time down to a minimum, so he asked for the best workers. Although a bit reckless, both Sam and George could be counted on to get the job done.
Hey, I'm going skydiving tomorrow. I'm jumping out of an airplane too.
After joking with his partner, George hastily scanned the warehouse. Across the room, he noticed a large drum with some hidden labels. What he hadn't noticed was that one drum was opened slightly.
Hey, Sam, you see the sparrow over here?
George tried calling Sam's attention to the drum, but Sam didn't seem to care. Another work buddy had mistakenly told Sam that this warehouse stored empty drums of ink. Assuming the drums were safe, he didn't want to investigate any further.
Look, we gotta get this fixed. I am starving. All right.
Feeling hungry, Sam told George they should get started and finish the job before lunch. Sam found an outlet and powered up the grinder. Meanwhile, George headed over to the toolbox to get a pair of pliers. At that point, he thought he saw a warning sign. Sam had already started to work. Sparks filled the air. Investigating further, George now clearly saw a flammable sign.
Sam!
Mistakes can be deadly when working around hazardous chemicals. Because of their carelessness, George ruptured 3 discs in his back, and he will always walk with a debilitating limp. Sam wasn't so lucky. He was killed in the explosion. One mistake, and no one gets a second chance.
Always read the warning labels in your immediate work area. They identify the chemical and list any physical hazards, such as flammability and explosive properties. They will detail what personal protective equipment to use and list any health hazards, whether acute, such as poisoning, or the slower chronic health hazards, such as cancer, heart, and lung damage. It's your right to know the dangers of all the hazardous chemicals you work with. OSHA, your company, and the chemical manufacturers all want you to exercise that right. But unless you take the responsibility for reading and using this information, you have no one to blame but yourself if something goes wrong. But for warning labels to be effective, you've got to go further. Check the material safety data sheet whenever you need more information about how to control the material's hazards. And then follow the instructions that the information gives you.
Well, when Sam and I got to the warehouse, we saw the drums from across the room, but we never took time to read the labels. Those labels. If we'd only read them, then we would have known what to do. I mean, we would have moved the drums and ventilated the area before working on the door. Instead, we just thought the drums were safe. It cost us.
This information can save you from a lot of misery and even death. But it can only be effective if you take the time to read and understand the MSDS and warning labels. Remember, the more information you and your co-workers have, the safer you'll be. That includes outside contractors too. Even though you don't work directly for a company that uses hazardous chemicals, you're still responsible to know the vital safety information provided on site.
Safety is everyone's responsibility. It doesn't happen by itself. So think. When you're working around hazardous chemicals, a small mistake can cause a big accident. Don't make a big mistake. Read the warning labels. Now for our second case, we'll take you to a textile mill where two workers are about to strip a machine part.
Jim and Mike had been working together for a couple of years. They had kind of a friendly battle going on. Each one constantly tried to outdo the other. They needed to get a part cleaned at an acid stripping tank. Mike didn't think Jim could get the job done with just hydrochloric acid, but Jim was betting on it. They decided to go ahead and do the job to find out just who was right. To prove his point, Mike was already set up to add another acid. He wasn't about to read the labels on the drums or consult the MSDS and determine the safe way to mix the chemicals. Instead, Mike started to argue that the solution wasn't strong enough. He had said all along that Jim needed to add 30 gallons of sulfuric acid to the hydrochloric in order to do the job right. Determined to show Jim, Mike poured the sulfuric acid into the tank. As the chemicals mixed, they slowly began to react. At first, Jim and Mike were arguing and hadn't noticed that something was wrong. However, it wasn't long before the reaction turned violent and toxic gas was released. The men panicked and didn't know what to do. They began to cough and choke on the fumes. They felt as though their lungs were on fire. By then, two other workers showed up to help. They thought that adding soda ash to the mix would calm things down, but adding another chemical just made things worse. More gas erupted and caused the workers to cough violently. The four eventually had to be hospitalized for pulmonary irritation from caustic gas.
Here's an example of what can happen when people ignore or fail to follow information the MSDS provides. How many of you know others who are doing the same thing? Ignoring the MSDS, believing they know what they're doing, and taking safety for granted. Don't be fooled. It will catch up with you, the same way it caught up with these folks. Now let's analyze this case step by step to see what went wrong.
The way I see it now, this accident didn't have to happen. I shouldn't have insisted on having it done my way. If we would have checked the MSDS, we wouldn't have done it my way. I guess it's too late now. I did go back and read the MSDS on hydrochloric acid. And it was right there in black and white. If you mix the acid with other materials, it can produce toxic gases. I had to learn the hard way.
Everyone involved here should have known what to do, but didn't. The vat of hydrochloric acid was in their immediate work area. so they should have at the very least known where to find the information they needed. Yet when the emergency occurred, no one consulted the MSDS to find out the best way to neutralize the hazard. Mike and Jim weren't the only ones at fault, though. The other workers responding to the accident made the situation worse by also failing to read the MSDS. No one used their training in the immediate hazards of their work area to respond correctly. Handling a chemical emergency must happen quickly, but must be done safely and intelligently as well. If these workers had read the emergency response procedures in the MSDS, they would have known to use an abundant amount of water or acid pumps to bring the situation under control. Even a simple call to an emergency response service, such as Chemtrec of the Chemical Manufacturers Association, would have provided them with the emergency information they needed and would have kept a bad situation from getting worse.
Once again, we have seen what can happen when you fail to take the time to understand the chemicals you're working with. 4 workers seriously injured because they all failed to read a safety book they are all supposed to be familiar with.
A chain is only as strong as its weakest link. When it comes to avoiding or controlling a chemical emergency, a team of employees is only as effective as its least informed member. The more information you and your co-workers have, the safer everyone will be. This time, no lives were lost. Next time, they might not be so lucky. Be sure you, 1, know where the MSDS for each hazardous chemical in your work area is kept. 2, are familiar with the most important points for each material you use. 3, know where to find emergency response information quickly. 4, check the MSDS whenever you're unsure or need more information. 5, follow the listed safety practices.
Now, let's look at case number 3.
Emily has been working in this chemical manufacturing research and development department for only a few months. Though she was new to this job, she had been a lab technician at the company for 4 or 5 years. Normally a good worker, Emily had just recently returned from vacation and her attitude was a little too relaxed. She had fallen behind on her assignments and was counting on the fact that there was so much paperwork in the front office that no one would really notice. She was in for a surprise, though. Unexpectedly, her new boss called and demanded the report she'd been working on right away. Seems as though her final report was holding up shop production. But that was just the start of her troubles. She still needed to mix some chemicals and conduct a few more tests in order to finish the missing report. Emily knew mixing the solution was a little dangerous, but she was in a rush and figured she could save some time by not checking the chemical in the MSDS. She decided to only put on a pair of gloves to get ready for the test. Emily regretted the fact that she hadn't gotten to her work earlier. She figured that she could make up the time by working quickly, even though that meant cutting corners. Emily took the gamble and hastily mixed the caustic soda and water.
As you saw, just knowing the hazards of the chemicals in your workplace is not always enough to keep you from an accident. You have to couple that knowledge with proper safety practices.
These safe work practices have been mandated by OSHA, and your employer has responded by developing, implementing, and maintaining a written hazard communication program. This program describes how the rules for labels and other warnings, material safety data sheets, and information and training will be met. This written plan includes measures employees should take to protect themselves, including the specific physical hazards of chemicals in the work area and the use of personal protective equipment. Points which were unfortunately neglected in this case. Let's take a closer look.
My mistake was rushing to get the job done and not putting safety first. The MSDS was right there, and to save time, I decided not to take a look at it. I mean, it's not fair. I'll always be paying for a simple mistake. If I'd only thought of my company's HazCom program and my training, I would have at least put on the proper PPE. I mean, it was right there for me to put on.
Emily's first mistake was not reading the reactivity information on caustic soda in the material safety data sheet. Then, if more information was needed, she could have consulted her organization's hazard communication program and spoken with her supervisor. This would have furnished her with additional site-specific information. And she could have effectively protected herself with the necessary personal protective equipment. Instead, failing to use her organization's hazard communication program wound up costing her dearly.
But it didn't have to happen. These guidelines are designed to give you the training you need to handle hazardous chemicals safely. Be sure to follow the safety procedures, practices, and rules explained in your training.
You have a right to know the dangers of any hazardous chemical you work with. And you have a right to be trained in how to protect yourself from danger. So exercise those rights by learning about the dangers in your workplace and finding out how to protect yourself. Accidents can be prevented if we all make safety a way of life and an integral part of our workplace. Think about this. According to the latest statistics, every 10 minutes, 2 people die and 170 will suffer disabling injuries from accidents on the job. Now, what about you? The Hazard Communication Standard gives you certain responsibilities, which include reading the warning labels, understanding the MSDSs, and using the training provided by following the safety rules in your workplace. Ignoring any of these steps puts you and your fellow workers at great risk. Don't become part of this group. Follow your organization's hazard communication program.
The cases you've just seen are true stories. The saddest story of all is that none of these tragedies had to happen. Remember, controlling hazardous chemicals requires a team effort. The more you and your coworkers know, the safer everyone will be. So, do your part and make your workplace a safe place.